Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. So last time we left off with the late Renaissance period. So we looked a little bit at mannerism. However, we were also looking at the Renaissance in Northern Europe, and so and how it was conditioned by events such as the Protestant Reformation and everything like that. But today we get into our next major historical or our next major art period in history, and that is the Baroque period. And so, jumping right on in. So, the Baroque period is a period roughly between 1580 and 1750. It kind of depends on where we're at. So it has some tie overs well into the 18th century, depending on where we're at. But generally speaking, between these dates. But it utilized Renaissance techniques to move art into the direction of things like drama, emotion, and splendor. So even though Renaissance art is becoming a little bit more realistic, they're starting to look at natural processes and everything that like that to increase the naturalism within their artwork. It's still a little bit kind of staged for the most part. It tends to be or have that kind of staged feeling to it. So we'll, in the Baroque period, we'll be kind of trying to go for this, kind of elevated sense of drama and emotion and, all of this kind of thing. But Baroque art also begins to show a great energy and feeling with this kind of dramatic use of lighting, scale, and composition. So once again, a lot of this kind of drama and emotion is going to be echoed in the use of lighting, how we're using the scale of the image. So we'll start to see a lot of, images in the heroic scale or larger than life size, if you will. But also composition and everything like this will begin to, play up this very kind of dramatic like quality. So we'll see a lot of times artists are going to be focused on like the kind of climactic element of a scene from, a mythology or the Bible or, what have you. But they also begin to explore more innovative uses of space and more intense ranges of light and shadow. So it's really during the Baroque period that we see things like chiaroscuro really becoming more, prominent within the world of art, especially painting. But it also kind of plays into sculpture as well, and we'll see some examples of that as well. So, the Baroque artists are also going to appeal to a much more highly emotional kind of level. So a lot of the this kind of extreme use of lighting and drama and things like that are meant to kind of pull at our heartstrings a little bit to increase the kind of emotional quality within an image and everything like that. But one of the other major hallmarks of this is that they begin to develop very vivid realism, and this is in part due to new technologies coming out of the Renaissance. So remember our camera obscura. This is a main technology in and about this time period. Many Baroque artists made use of the camera obscura, and once again, it helps to increase the realism within their art, and it's just a tool that they're using to make their art more successful. So aside from that, Baroque art was spawned by the Catholic Church as a direct response to the Protestant Reformation and in an effort to kind of promote what they called the Counter Reformation. So the Council of Trent encouraged artists to aid in prayer and to glorify the sacrament of the saints. And much of Baroque art begins to place this kind of new emphasis on personal and mystical types of faith. So, in the Protestant Reformation, as we saw last time, many of the artists in Northern Europe begin to outright reject religious imagery within art and all of this kind of idea. And a lot of this is once again kind of brought out of protest against the kind of wide scale corruption of the Catholic Church at that time. But we do see that many artists during the Baroque period who are still adherent to the Catholic faith basically take up this call from the papacy and whatnot to really make a doubling down on Catholicism. So a lot of Baroque artwork is very inherently Catholic in its origin. A lot of the subject matter has to do with the martyrdom of saints and other things like that. But this is meant to create a kind of connection between, common people, the viewer, and these, saints and other holy figures who are not necessarily very important people in their own lives and everything. Instead, they are, kind of giving up their lives for their faith and whatnot. So it's creating a link between, once again, this kind of physical and spiritual world, but also appealing to us as the faithful to not abandon the faith simply based on the kind of corruption of church officials and whatnot, in light of the fact that, we as individuals can still have, kind of major implications within, the faith and everything like that. So, once again, one of the major hallmarks of Baroque art, aside from, this kind of, elevated use of drama, lighting, and all of that, is this kind of doubling down on, Catholic dogma and things like this. However, we will see examples. That's not always the case. Once again, the north of Europe is also going to be dominated by the Baroque period as well. And owing to that Counter-Reformation, they are going to deal with Baroque art in a different kind of way as well. But generally speaking, our first major Baroque artist is widely considered to be Titian. And so here we can see Titian in self-portrait. This was made toward the end of his life. I believe he was in his 70s or 80s when he made this portrait. But we have talked about Titian quite a bit. He's very influential in terms of not only helping to develop the practice of oil painting in Italy, but he's also one of the first artists to really start painting on canvas. He develops a number of techniques for oil painting on canvas, etc., etc., etc. So he's very, very important. However, here we can see one of his more major works from the kind of high point of his career. But this is, a work that echoes this kind of counter-Reformation idea, but it also embodies this kind of humanist idea, once again, coming out of the Renaissance. Titian kind of bridges the gap a little bit in between the Renaissance and the Baroque period. But what we can see here is a very typical scene of this period as well. You'll see this scene a million times within the Baroque context, but this is the Assumption of the Virgin. And so this is a scene that's meant to kind of allegorically represent the Virgin Mary being taken up into heaven after her death. So we can see this, and we can view this painting very much like that Holy Trinity painting by Masaccio, in that it's meant to represent this translation between the physical and spiritual worlds. But we can also see a number of our major, kind of Christian motifs that are present in this as well. So in this painting, we can see that we have a major delineation between this physical and spiritual world, which cuts basically kind of right here about a third of the way up. And so we can see that the lighter aspect of the painting is reflected by that kind of spiritual light of the divine radiating forth out of heaven, if you will. And then we can see the physical world is meant to, it's much darker. So it's meant to be this kind of homage to the fact that in the spirit, or in the physical world, we're kind of devoid of that light of God. In that we are not one with it in the moment. Even though we might be practicing faith and whatnot, it's still, something that we won't achieve until after our deaths and things like that. So there is a kind of clear delineation between the physical and spiritual world in that regard. However, we can also see in that physical world, all of these figures are meant to represent the apostles and other holy figures. Once again, very, very common. But they're all depicted in this kind of emotional state as they witness the body of the Virgin Mary being assumed into the heavens. And she's being assumed into the heavens on top of this kind of cloud, which is supported by these putti or cherub angels. and whatnot. So these cherub angels that we see in this kind of cloud, also we can see that echoed in the background here, these kind of little angel faces in the clouds. This is a way that we might go about representing God or the Holy Spirit in many times, or at least many times. However, we do actually have an actual image of God up here at the top. But once again, this kind of background element would also be a very common way of representing God in this context. But this also tends to reference the idea of the Holy Spirit as well. So once again, this is a kind of symbolic motif that's used quite a bit, but can have various connotations depending on the context of the image that we're using. So aside from that, once again, we know Virgin Mary, blue and red every time. But once again, this is meant to create a kind of, once again, this link between the physical, spiritual worlds, but it's also meant to create a link in the minds of us as the viewer, in that, we can still be a part of this faith and whatnot, and that there is a clear delineation between the kind of, the problems of the physical world, and that we are not perfect beings and whatnot, but we can still be elated in this sense, and everything like that. But once again, very very typical, owing to this idea of humanism, counter-reformation, all of this kind of stuff. But we can also see, in this, stylistically speaking, this use of chiaroscuro is very present. So it's a little bit more subtle than some of our more pronounced examples that will come out later, specifically with guys like Caravaggio and whatnot. But we can still see it's being used to echo the emotional quality in the figures down here, especially. So we can see, light is just kind of cast just across the high points of information, especially in like the faces of the apostles here. So we get that, kind of highlight cutting across, so that we can see the kind of emotional turmoil in their faces and everything like that. But likewise, we can also see this emotional quality in the Virgin Mary herself, who is expressing what usually is coined or termed as this kind of spiritual ecstasy. And so we'll see examples of that here in a minute as well. But we can see that her face has this kind of like awe, kind of look upon it. But once again, this is meant to echo this idea of ecstasy in that, becoming one with the spiritual world, or becoming one with the light of the divine, is described as being a kind of pleasurable yet painful experience at the same time. So it's this kind of weird like elation effect and all of this kind of idea. So once again, it's playing up this kind of mystical spiritualism within the kind of confines of Catholic dogma, but it's also playing up this relationship between the physical, spiritual world, all of this kind of thing. Now, another major aspect of Baroque art in particular is what's known as tenebrism. And tenebrism refers to an extremely pronounced version of chiaroscuro, which produces very violent contrasts in light and dark. Often entire areas of a painting are left totally black in this regard as well. So here we can see an example of chiaroscuro. If we compare it, of tenebrism, but if we compare it to, say, like regular chiaroscuro, which we see in Titian's painting here, we can see just how much more pronounced it really is. So this is really characteristic of Baroque art especially. It's even more indicative of Baroque art in Spain and in Italy, more particularly, although it does exist in other places. Certain artists in France will make very heavy use of tenebrism, and we'll see that as well. But once again, here we can see a pretty typical example of that. So here we have the Spanish artist Giuseppe de Ribera, but this is the Martyrdom of St. Andrew. And once again, many times, especially in Spain, these kind of paintings of martyred saints are very, very common. But once again, it's meant to create an appeal with us as the viewer and as the faithful to say that, most of these martyrs, these saints, originate as just average individual people. They're not, like nobility. They're not high ups in the clergy or anything like that. But they are, suffering for their faith and, all of this kind of thing. So these are meant to be inspirational for the faithful. And once again, it's a kind of doubling down of that Catholic dogma in that, we don't want to stray away from that faith. Instead, we want to, embrace it in a myriad of ways. But fairly typical. So we can see, the light is being used in this sense to echo the main kind of portions of information within the scene, but it's also meant to play up the kind of drama within the scene as well. So it only gives us this kind of highlight across the main important aspects, but it's meant to create this kind of dark, foreboding sense, which creates an emotional appeal to, the figure of Saint Andrew there and us as the viewer, in that, we can sense that something ominous is about to happen to him. He's about to be, crucified in this sense and everything like that. But once again, it's meant to create an emotional appeal between us as the viewer and the subject matter. And so we are meant to contemplate the martyrdom of the saints in this sense and everything like that, so as to contemplate where we stand within our own faith, our own spirituality, and all of this kind of idea. Now, aside from these kinds of guys, one of our most important Baroque artists is this individual, and this is Michelangelo de Merici, otherwise known more colloquial as Caravaggio. So we'll refer to him as Caravaggio. This is one of the only known portraits ever made of him, but a very brooding figure. He gets himself in a lot of trouble with the papacy. He's threatened with excommunications a few times. Largely due to his kind of, debauched lifestyle. He's a kind of a violent alcoholic and, cavorts with prostitutes, so, all that kind of stuff. It's also theorized that he might have been, homosexual, which would have definitely put him into major odds with the Catholic Church and everything at that time. Now that's a lot of that is speculation, but it's kind of interesting factor. But Caravaggio is really important for developing this kind of idea of tenebrism, and in fact, it's Caravaggio's use of it that really inspires many other artists within the Baroque period to, encapsulate this tenebristic style. So many artists are traveling to Italy at this time to, kind of study from the Renaissance masters and whatnot. But they see Caravaggio's work and they're just kind of awe-inspired. And so they, once again, they begin to make copies of his work. They begin to copy his kind of aesthetic style and everything like this. So he's very influential in that regard. So after Caravaggio, many other artists begin to embrace this tenebrism and this kind of style, if you will. But here we can see one of his, more important works in terms of this kind of idea of the Counter-Reformation. So once again, we have a scene that's related to one of the apostles, so one of the major kind of saintly figures. So this is the conversion of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. And St. Paul originally was a kind of Roman official. He was definitely kind of involved in the persecution of early Christians early on. But on his way to the city of Damascus in modern-day Syria from Judea, Paul is said to have received this prophetic revelation in which the angels and the Almighty come to him in this kind of ecstatic vision, and he's thrown from his horse in this moment of ecstasy, and he receives this prophetic revelation, and then he becomes a Christian, and then he goes about trying to evangelize others into the Christian faith and everything like this. But what we see in this scene is once again this kind of moment of high climax of the story, the kind of most pivotal moment in the story. But we can also see the most dramatic moment in the story. So we can see, St. Paul in his kind of Roman, kind of garb here. It has been thrown thrown from his horse in this moment of ecstasy. So we see his hands up in the air as he's receiving this prophetic revelation, which is once again meant to be kind of pleasurable but painful at the same time. So it's meant to be this kind of eye-opening, kind of event for him, and everything like that, an epiphany, if you will. But we see that, the tenebrism is being used to echo this idea of the drama within the scene. So we see that light is only cascading across the kind of high points of interest there. We see, his horse is a major, kind of element within this, but we don't even get, full, kind of accounts. It's really just little aspects of all of these different things that are, kind of prominently featured against that kind of tenebristic shadow and everything like this. But once again, this is meant to hearken to this idea that, those who might have gone astray from the faith could always be welcomed back in that, Paul was a pagan Roman initially, but he converts to Christianity and everything like this. So this is meant to be, once again, this idea of the Counter-Reformation, this doubling down of Catholic dogma, but it's also meant to, kind of echo this idea that those who might have strayed away from the faith are always welcome to come back. We can repent and all of this kind of thing. So this is another major aspect. A lot of these kind of saintly paintings is this kind of idea of the conversion of the saints, or once again the martyrdom of the saints, so as to show these kind of otherwise common people relating to and interacting with the divine in a various kind of myriad of ways, so that we as the faithful, we as the viewers of this, could also potentially interact with the faith and with the divine in the same kind of way, if we will. So it's creating, once again, an appeal between us in the viewer in the physical world with these kind of beings in the spiritual world and everything like that. However, we see a variety of different kinds of imagery from Caravaggio. Once again, most of his work is very heavily dealing with the saints, with the martyrs, or with other holy figures. So we saw this example a little earlier on. It's probably one of my more favorite examples of his work. But this is the David with the head of Goliath. So once again, this is the only known self-portrait of Caravaggio, and he does this as a kind of pittance for one of his kind of transgressions against the Pope. So he's threatened with excommunication, and in order to apologize and to also kind of show his piety, he makes this painting for the Pope, so as to kind of apologize and everything like that. But once again, we can see this nice contrast in the tenebrism there. We also have this nice contrast between, the kind of youthful appearance of David and then the kind of grizzled appearance of Goliath there, and, all of this kind of thing. So we talked about this a little bit more earlier on, but aside from Caravaggio, we also have major artists in the realm of sculpture that are also embracing this kind of, Baroque-like aesthetic. So the most prominent Baroque sculptor of this period is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. He does a number of very prominent sculptural works. Most of his work is in the Vatican and other very prestigious kind of collections there. But here we can see one of his more famous examples. This is also a David, but this is a nice example, unlike that one that we saw with Donatello or the David by Michelangelo, in that, Donatello is showing us the kind of, aftermath of the scene or the action, but he's also showing the David in this kind of sensual, effeminate kind of manner. But then Michelangelo shows us, a David that's, very, kind of, masculine and manly, but it's also the moment before the kind of high point of the action in the story. Versus, say, Bernini, who shows us the actual climax of the story. So we can see the figure of David, who is depicted here as like a full-grown man, but we can see the contortion in his body as he is just hurled or is about to hurl his stone. So we can see, his sling here, he's got in his hand. It's almost as if he's either just flung the stone or he's about to, kind of reel back to fling it at Goliath. So we can also see this kind of, anguish in his face. So he's, very stern, very angry looking. Once again, it highlights this kind of action within the scene. And in that sense, we can also start to see that Bernini is starting to look at this idea of chiaroscuro within his sculptural work as well. So we can see that the way that the body is contorted helps to create that contrast between shadow and light within the form itself. So this is a kind of interesting way that we can use chiaroscuro within a three-dimensional work of art as opposed to the implied lighting and space in a two-dimensional work of art. But once again, we see that the kind of dramatic aspects of this kind of aesthetic are played up in this work. So we can see that contortion in his body. We can see the kind of emotion in his face. All of these kinds of ideas. So very, very common aspect of this. But here we can see probably Bernini's most famous sculpture, his most well-known sculpture, and this is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And this really embraces many of these kind of Baroque Counter-Reformation ideas. So what we have here is a figure of Saint Teresa as she is receiving her kind of ecstatic vision or her, kind of prophetic revelation. What's interesting about this is that Saint Teresa was actually an individual who lived not too long prior to when this was made, and she was actually canonized very quickly after her death. I believe, she died maybe 100 years prior to this and had been canonized, within 20 or 30 years after her death or something like that, which is very unique because most saints, it takes many, many centuries after their deaths to become saints, if you will. So, this is something that the Catholic Church is doing once again to double down against the Protestant Reformation. So we're gonna, see a big influx of, kind of saintly figures coming out, new people being canonized, and all of this kind of thing. However, in the kind of story, Saint Teresa, she was a nun, and she was said to have received this prophetic revelation, from God in the form of this ecstasy, and she described it as being, at once painful, but at the same time pleasurable. And so we see that allegorically represented in this sense by the angel here holding this arrow. And so this is meant to echo this idea of receiving this prophetic revelation. So the arrow would pierce her heart, thus creating this link once again between the physical and the spiritual world. But, the arrow would be meant to echo this idea of the pain of receiving this vision from God, and this is like overwhelming, if you will. But then we can see, Teresa herself is kind of in the throes of ecstasy at the same time. So she almost has this kind of sexual like pleasure written across the figure there. So if we see her face is kind of like, thrown back in that kind of ecstatic moment. But once again, it's meant to echo this kind of pleasure of receiving this divine light, this divinely inspired prophecy or, vision, if you will, all of this kind of idea. But so once again, it's hearkening to that idea that, we as the faithful can potentially have these interactions with the divine, and that it's not necessarily, the Pope who is the intermediary. It's, it could happen to any of us depending on how good our faith is and all of this kind of idea. But what I find interesting about this too is it's also meant to echo this idea of drama and whatnot. So not only in the way she's kind of posed in this lounging position, the kind of emotion across her face and everything like that, but it's also meant to echo that idea of chiaroscuro as well. And so we can see that echoed by like the way the shadows are cast by the drapery here especially. But what's interesting is that this sculpture is actually situated within a church. I believe this is in the Vatican, but it's situated in this kind of niche that has a skylight just above it. And so, natural radiant light would cast down through the skylight onto the sculpture, but it's also echoed by these golden rods here, which would help to echo that kind of highlighted effect. But these golden rods are also meant to represent that idea of the divine light, but also the divine presence physically coming and, touching her in this kind of, prophetic way, if you will. Once again, we saw an example of a very similar thing to this in one of those icon paintings from the Byzantine period, in which, in the Annunciation, the kind of golden, light beam from heaven is striking the figure of the Virgin Mary to, kind of, symbolically, create the link to, her impregnation by the Holy Spirit and whatnot. So this is also meant to echo that idea of the Holy Spirit, and that it is coming to her and whatnot. But we also have that echoed once again by the kind of angel here. So the angel is a little bit of an ambiguous form. It's a male figure, but it's also kind of ambiguous as well. So very common kind of feature of angelic representations there as well. But once again, we can also see this kind of joy on the angel's face, echoing forth that idea of spiritual elation and everything like this. Now, aside from sculpture and whatnot, and the Baroque work in Italy, we also do have Baroque artwork coming out of Northern Europe as well. In particular, if we remember the region known as Flanders from our last discussion, Flanders kind of becomes the home of the Northern Baroque kind of period, because as the Protestant Reformation comes about, the Spanish actually go and conquer the area of Flanders and kind of bring it back under the yoke of Catholicism. So in that region, we see a very unique kind of form of Baroque art that blends this idea of Italian kind of chiaroscuro, tenebrism, and all of these Baroque ideas with this kind of counter-Reformation aesthetic as well. So we'll see, even in the Baroque world of this era, or this area of the world, they're going to be creating religious artworks for sure, but we also see that these artists in particular are going to be a little more focused on like mythological subjects, genre scenes, all of these kinds of things as well. So, one of the more prominent examples of an artist from Northern Europe dealing with the Baroque aesthetic is Peter Paul Rubens here. And he's a very important artist. He also bases a lot of his artwork off of the aesthetics of Caravaggio. So he travels to Italy and studies from him, but he's also very prolific. He does hundreds of paintings throughout his lifetime. He also had a very massive studio in which he had over 400 assistants that would help him, in the creation of these paintings. So very prolific. Aside from that, he was also a very prominent diplomat in his time. So he actually traveled quite extensively. And he did artwork for a myriad of different, kind of kings and, nobility and all kinds of different stuff. But because of that, he does a variety of different scenes that are outside of the biblical narrative. And so for that reason, he's kind of more of an interesting artist in my opinion. He's one of my personal favorite artists of all time. But here we can see one of his, kind of more secular works. So this is The Tiger Hunt, and this has certain allegorical homages to what comes to be known as Orientalism. So this kind of exotic subject matter from, the Middle East, North Africa, these kinds of places. But it also has certain ties to things like mythology, classical mythology. So, here, we can see obviously like tigers, lions, and leopards are exotic beasts and whatnot. But they have certain connotations to things like kingship, once again, going way, way back. So this would have been commissioned for a king initially, or at least a noble lord. So it would promote this idea of their grandeur, their power, whatnot. But we can also see that exoticism in the sense that we have these two kind of Middle Eastern figures that are wearing turbans and whatnot. But we can also see these two figures that are meant to hearken to that idea of classical Roman antiquity. So even though they're wearing kind of contemporary armor, for the 1500s. It's kind of stylized in a way that's harkening back to the Roman legions and everything like that. But we can also see an interesting homage here. So we see this figure that's kind of wrestling this lion off of this other figure. But this is meant to echo this idea of not only Hercules battling the Nemean lion, so also an homage to classical mythology, but it also harkens to this idea of Samson slaying the lion as well. So also a kind of biblical homage there. So interesting kind of hodgepodge of different stylistic and metaphorical symbolism and everything like that. But Rubens does also promote a lot of mythological work. He does a lot of the most interesting mythological work, in my opinion, from this time. It's very dramatic. Here we can see one such example, once again, playing up all of these ideas of using chiaroscuro and tenebrism and heightened emotional quality to highlight the dramatic qualities within a scene and the kind of action-oriented qualities within a scene. So what we see here, this is referred to as the Fall of Paithon, and this is a scene from classical, Greco-Roman mythology. And in the story, the son of Apollo, and Apollo's the kind of sun god and whatnot. He drives the sun chariot across the sky every day. But his son decides that he can do this, in his own arrogance. And so he steals the sun chariot and he tries to drive it across the sky for a day. But he quickly realizes that he can't control these powerful horses drawing the chariot and everything. And so he loses control of it and it starts to go wild and causing all kinds of chaos and destruction and whatnot. And then Zeus, decides to strike him down with a thunderbolt. So what we see here depicted is that kind of high point in the action of the scene in which Zeus is striking Paithon down with the thunderbolt. And so we can see that thunderbolt reference there. But we can see, the kind of, like tension and drama in all of the figures. They're contorting around, this kind of major thrusting, kind of element in the composition and everything. I love the kind of reeling, of like being, awestruck by this scene and everything like that. But what I also find interesting about this particular scene is it's a mythological scene that's meant to explain certain natural phenomena that would have been unfamiliar to the ancient Greeks, or at least that they would not have been able to explain in naturalistic kinds of ways. So in the story, Paithon, as he loses control of the sun chariot, it crashes into the continent of Africa and it burns everyone alive. And so hence, this is the reason in the ancient Greek mindset why people from Africa have darker skin, because the sun chariot burned them, of course. Now, obviously, this is complete nonsense, but I've always found it interesting to see how ancient peoples tried to interpret certain natural phenomenon that they couldn't understand in any other way. So obviously, this, once again, it's complete nonsense and everything like that, but it's, once again, we have this really kind of dramatic scene. It's a mythical scene instead of religious scene, so it's, once again, it's interesting that, they're still doing this owing to the Renaissance and everything like that. But here we can see probably one of my most favorite paintings by Peter Paul Rubens. He actually does a lot of, fairly dark subject matter. So here we can see this is actually done in collaboration with another artist, but this is the head of Medusa. And so Medusa, as we know, or should know, is, the Gorgon from classical mythology. So her gaze would turn anyone into stone who looked upon her and everything. So it's a very fearsome kind of creature in Greek mythology and whatnot. But here we can see the moment after the Greek hero Perseus has slayed Medusa and everything like that. So we see all of her snake hair and whatnot. But this is also an interesting painting in that it's meant to be a menagerie painting. So we have the mythical element to kind of add, character to what would otherwise be a kind of depiction of exotic animals. So, snakes and lizards and newts and, other things like that. This is another kind of hallmark of like still life painting at this time, is to do kind of exotic things, that are coming from abroad and everything like that. It's kind of blending the two together in an interesting way, in my opinion there. Once again, it's a little bit more on the gory, brutal side, but it's, kind of interesting that he's doing this kind of work at this time as well. Now, aside from that, once again, Rubens is very prolific. He's a major diplomat. He does a lot of major portraiture of the nobility around Europe at this time. Here we can see this is Kaiser Maximilian the First, the Holy Roman Emperor. So if we're unfamiliar, the Holy Roman Empire was a kind of loose conglomeration of these German principalities that kind of loosely came together in a confederation. But this will evolve into the nation of Germany that we know of today later on. But once again, he's cavorting with the kind of elites of society at this time and everything like that. So he's a very kind of important artist in that regard. Now, it is during the Baroque period that we also begin to see that, other places aside from like Flanders or Italy begin to rise in artistic competence. So it's really during this period that Spain starts to come into the forefront of the artistic world. France also comes into the forefront of the art world as well. Prior to this, it doesn't mean that art doesn't exist there and that they're not, dealing with the Renaissance ideas and everything like that. It's just not as wholehearted as, say, in Northern Europe or Italy and whatnot. But during the Baroque time, these other places in Europe start to come into their own kind of prominence. And so one of the most prominent examples of a artist in Spain dealing with this Baroque aesthetic is Diego Velázquez here. And he's probably the most famous, kind of Spanish painter from this period of time. In fact, one of the greatest Spanish painters of all time. Also one of my own personal favorite artists of all time. But Diego Velázquez was the court painter of King Philip IV of Spain, who we see here. This is the second to last Habsburg monarch of Spain. But he's also a major kind of figure within the art world as well. He's a major patron of the arts. He commissions not only Velázquez, but other prominent artists such as Ribera, who we saw a few minutes ago, and other major kind of Spanish and Italian artists to do all manner of different kinds of work. But here we can see one of Velázquez's many portraits of King Philip there. Kind of interesting. But Velázquez does a lot of very interesting work in this regard. He does do a lot of religious work, but he also does a lot of mythical work as well, which I find more interesting. He also does a lot of genre painting, so paintings of everyday life. So he's kind of interesting in that regard, especially compared to most other Spanish artists of this time who are really like only making paintings of martyred saints and things. Like that. So like we saw with Ribera on that Tenebrism slide. But Velázquez is a little bit more interesting in that regard. So here we can see Apollo at the Forge of Vulcan, one of his more prominent pieces. But in this is a mythical scene. But in this, we see the god Apollo is coming to the forge of the god Vulcan, who is responsible for metallurgy and, all of these kinds of things. And he's telling Vulcan that his wife, Venus, the goddess of love and desire, has basically committed adultery on him with Mars, the god of war. And so he's actually engaged in making weapons for Mars, the god of war, in this moment. So we can see the kind of shock on Vulcan's face here. We can also see the shock on his, kind of attendants there. It's like this very like, holy shit, what did you just say kind of moment. So we see that once again, that kind of playing up of, the emotional quality within this owing to that Baroque aesthetic. We can also see Velázquez a little bit more, kind of adept at using chiaroscuro versus, say, full-blown tenebrism and everything. He does use tenebrism some, but it's a little bit more subtle, such as we see here. But we can also see that this is also a very contemporary scene as well. So the armor that they're making, all of the kind of accoutrements are very, contemporary to the 1600s when this was made. So once again, it creates a link between us as the viewer in that moment with this mythical subject matter as well, by creating, kind of a commonality and things that we might encounter in a daily basis, and all of this kind of idea. But once again, hearkening to this kind of mythical subject matter as well. But Velázquez's more interesting paintings really kind of fall into the realm of like genre painting, and this is probably his most well-known painting, if not his most interesting painting, in terms of what it represents, who it's meant to represent, and who we as the viewer are supposed to be. So if we're looking here, this is what's known as Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor. And so what we see, the main subject of the painting itself is the Infanta of Spain here, the Princess of Spain. And so we see her surrounded by her kind of maids of honor. So these would be her attendants, if you will, that would accompany her on a daily basis. They would, make sure that she, had everything she needed and everything like that. But we can also see represented several other interesting figures in this regard. So not only do we have the Princess of Spain there, we also have a self-portrait of Diego Velázquez here in the background. And then on the opposite side, we see this figure that is meant to represent a court dwarf. And this is an interesting aspect of many noble kind of families at this time. They would actually hire, little people and other people that we would consider to be, kind of anomalies or whatnot, to be forms of entertainment within their households. So it's, once again, it's not really very PC nowadays. It's kind of a lamentable aspect, but it is an aspect of this painting. And, obviously being a member of the royal household probably afforded this individual a better life than they would have otherwise been, kind of able to achieve at that time. But once again, it's just kind of an interesting aspect of that. We can also see this figure here. I believe this is meant to represent the Prince of Spain as well, who later becomes King Charles II. But we can see in the background another figure. This is meant to represent the Count of Olivares. So this is the kind of prime minister of Spain at that time. So he's kind of entering into this room and looking at the scene that's unfolding. But interestingly, if we look just to the left of Olivares there, we can see a mirror in the background, and this mirror is reflecting a portrait of the king, King Philip, and his wife, the Queen Maria Theresa here. And so what we're actually seeing is a painting from the view of the king and queen themselves, as they're having their portrait painted by Velázquez here in the background. So it's a kind of interesting thing. It plays with our perception of the scene, and our perception of who the viewer is within the scene, because once again, this would have originally been used for or displayed for the private use of the king and queen themselves, so it wouldn't have been on public display. So it's kind of the people that they considered important to their lives, if you will, and everything like this. So we are viewing the scene from the standpoint of the royalty there and everything like that. So this makes it a kind of interesting scene in that regard. Once again, playing up our nature perception and everything like that. But we can see this is probably one of Diego Velázquez's more pronounced tenebristic paintings. So we can see that, lighting being used to kind of dramatically echo the main subject of the princess there and everything like that. But aside from Spain, we also see that France begins to come into artistic prominence during this period as well. The most kind of, influential French artist of this time is this individual. This is Nicolas Poussin, and here we can see a self-portrait of him. But he is, really well known for doing religious subjects, but he's also well known for, mythical subjects. A lot of his mythical subjects tend to be a little bit more on the dark side. So I don't have an example, but Poussin is also really influential in bringing about the kind of prominence of landscape painting painting within, French art especially. So landscape painting exists prior to this. It's very prominent in like Northern Europe and, the Dutch Netherlands and, places like that. But in this sense, Poussin is really adept at creating these landscape environments in which we have a figurative representation. So unlike like Caravaggio, who is kind of removing the figures from recognizable space with that tenebrism, Poussin is more focused on representing the human form within a landscape setting. And so he doesn't really embrace tenebrism so much. He does use chiaroscuro quite extensively, but it's a little bit more subtle in terms of playing up this kind of more naturalistic sense of lighting and everything like that. But a lot of his, religious subject matter, such as we see here, is once again promoting these ideas of the Counter-Reformation and everything like that. So what we see here, this is the sacrament of ordination, and this is a very common scene at this time. Once again, this is a scene that's used to, basically create an homage to the legitimacy of the Catholic Church over that of the Protestant Reformation. So once again, upholding and extolling these Catholic virtues. So the sacrament of the ordination is a scene in which Jesus, who we see here in the red cloak and blue, gives the keys to the kingdom of heaven to St. Peter. So we see St. Peter here. St. Peter is usually represented in blue and yellow. Once again, all of the various apostles that we see here are represented in these kind of color coordinations that they're known for. We can see Judas is the kind of dark figure here on the far side. But once again, in the biblical narrative, Jesus gives the keys to the kingdom of heaven to St. Peter, and then he challenges St. Peter to, go and start his church on the earth. And so the church that St. Peter founds is the Roman Catholic Church. And so this is a scene that's meant to hearken to the legitimacy of Catholicism as being the only one true religion, all of this kind of idea and everything like that. But once again, it echoes this kind of emerging sense of landscape. It echoes this, chiaroscuro-like use of lighting to enhance the drama in the scene. We also see this kind of emotional quality across all of the figures. So, we see some of them are kind of ecstatic in this moment, maybe a little jealous or, things like that. Judas definitely seems kind of brooding and everything like this. So we're playing up those emotional qualities and everything like that. Now, aside from Poussin, we do also have another major French Baroque artist, and that is Georges de la Tour, who we see here, and he's probably the more well-known tenebristic artist in France, and he does a lot of these scenes, and he really specializes in this tenebrism that's very pronounced. And in fact, the only light source in many of his paintings is a single candle, which we see here. But here we can see a scene that he does quite a number of times. This is the penitent Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene, obviously, this is also hearkening to this idea of the Counter-Reformation in that, Mary Magdalene is said to have been a prostitute, and then she kind of gives up that lifestyle to embrace and follow Christ and, all of this. So this is meant to hearken to that idea that even if we have strayed from the faith or anything like that, we can always still be welcomed back into that faith, and we can repent and all of these kinds of things. But we can also see Mary Magdalene is also holding a memento mori, so a skull. So she's meant to be contemplating the martyrdom of Christ and, all of this kind of idea as well. So once again, hearkening to this idea of holy figures, of saints. We're using the lighting and extreme kind of, chiaroscuro here, or tenebrism, to play up the emotional quality of the scene. So it's meant to create tension within her as she's kind of wrestling with this, change of identity and, dealing with this kind of idea of mortality and all of these kinds of things. So once again, just because we're using, the lighting to play up this emotional quality. Sorry, I got the hiccups there for a minute. But we're using it to play up this emotional quality, but it's also meant to more subtly reference some of these other, kind of symbolic links to, death and martyrdom and all of these kinds of things as well. Now, that brings us to the Northern Baroque. And so, very much like, the Northern Renaissance, it's going to be characterized by a little bit different means of representation than, say, in parts that are dominated by, Catholicism and whatnot. So, we'll see that, like in the, Northern Renaissance, we see a much more, kind of proliferation of non-religious scenes. So mythical scenes, genre scenes, especially landscape, all of these kinds of these things. Still life is also a major element of that as well. But that's not to say that religious work doesn't exist. It's just, once again, going to be a little bit more rare or a little bit more subtle. But so the Dutch Netherlands are one of the major, kind of homes of the Baroque period in Northern Europe. And so the Dutch Republic patrons were increasingly wealthy middle class merchants and bankers. So the Dutch kind of Netherlands are not a kingdom. It's one of the first kind of major republics, kind of democratic republics in Europe. But a lot of these, kind of merchant, people are commissioning artworks that are, not explicitly religious or explicitly, kind of noble in quality and everything like that. So we see this lack of religious work, prompts this kind of proliferation of landscape, still life, portraiture, and genre painting. So these are going to be the more major subjects in, Northern Baroque art. Now that doesn't mean that mythical subjects don't exist or religious subjects don't exist. They're just going to be a little bit more rare or more downplayed. So Dutch painters made art more accessible and understandable in everyday terms. So they also begin to make a lot of kind of links between, classical, kind of antiquity and the modern, kind of contemporary world that they're living in. They're also dealing with subjects that are more common. So they're dealing with, common people, common daily events, which have, once again, a kind of a link in common people's minds because they're interacting with these things on a daily basis. So once again, it becomes more secular, less religious. But one of the most prominent artists of this period in the Dutch Netherlands is Rembrandt van Rijn. And so here we can see Rembrandt. This is one of a number of portraits that he paints of himself. He paints over 80 of them throughout his life, and they're interesting because they highlight this idea of emotion. At certain times in his youth, they're kind of, wild and exaggerated. He's making funny faces and stuff like that. Then as he becomes, an adult and, he becomes a prominent artist, he, is very regal in how he depicts himself. But then towards the end of his life, he actually starts to suffer, some financial hardships and everything like that. His eyesight starts to wane a little. And he starts to contemplate his own mortality and everything like that. So his portraiture becomes a little more somber, more subdued, everything like this. But we can see one such example here. Rembrandt is also, it's probably hard to see in this image, but if we were to look at his face, he's also one of the first artists to really start making heavy use of impasto. So he's actually bringing a kind of physicality to the painting itself. So it actually has a physical presence on the canvas. It's not just a, smooth illusionistic image. It actually kind of comes out at us a little bit and everything like that. But Rembrandt is really well known for doing all kinds of different subjects. He's really well known for his genre subjects especially. But here we can see one harkening back to this idea of the Renaissance and our exploration of new scientific kind of endeavors. So here we can see the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. So this is actually something that Rembrandt would have been witness to. He actually went to this, anatomy lesson. He would learn from it. He drew from it, everything like that. But we can see once again this interest in human dissection, which begins to lend itself to the advancement of medicine, of medical knowledge, artistic knowledge, all of these kinds of things. So it's a kind of, gory, a little morbid, but once again, this is an an aspect of artistic life at this time that would have been very prominent. Most artists would have gone to anatomy lectures like this in order to learn about the human body and to draw from it and everything like that. So once again, we can also see this kind of emotional quality in that, I love the kind of looks on everyone's faces, especially this guy of like trying to get in close to really see well and, everything like that. But perhaps Rembrandt's most well-known painting is this example. This is what's known as the Night Watch. And this is a painting that kind of characterizes life in the Dutch Netherlands at this time. So the Netherlands are kind of a Protestant country, whereas Flanders, which borders it just to the west there, is brought under the yoke of Spain to kind of reinforce Catholicism as the dominant religion. And so there's a lot of warfare that goes on in this region of the world based on these kind of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. And so here we can see an aspect of that. This is not actually meant to be a night scene. It's just the tenebrism used by Rembrandt makes it kind of look like a night scene. But this would be the kind of prominent militia within the city of that Rembrandt is occupying. I believe he is from Delft or Antwerp. I'm sorry, but so this is actually the kind of mayor of that city, the leader of this militia and everything. So a prominent individual within the society, but we can see him, kind of bringing together all of these militiamen who would patrol the city at nighttime, but also throughout the day to kind of, act as a police force, but also to act as a defensive force against, raids by Spanish Catholics. And, during, this is a period known as the 30 Years' War, in which Protestants and Catholics are, very, very violently clashing against one another. But what I find interesting about this painting is that it's kind of controversial in that, all of these different individuals are all basically prominent individuals within the society, and they were all kind of vying for their placement within the painting itself. And so obviously the two individuals who we see in the front are the people who actually commissioned the painting, but all of these other figures, they kind of tried to vie against one another for more prominent placement within it. And many of them were actually really pissed off at Rembrandt once it was kind of completed, because they only have just this little kind of tiny presence in the background, or they're obscured and all of this kind of idea. So once again, it's a little controversial in that regard, because there was a lot of fighting over it when it was made. But once again, it's a nice example of a kind of secular work. It's representing something that we probably would have seen on a daily basis. We probably, if we lived in this city at this time, we probably would have known who most of these individuals were. They were very prominent individuals and everything like that. But once again, we see the kind of tenebrism being used to highlight the kind of main, kind of important subject within the overall composition. We can also see that it's a little bit less emotional in that sense, but we do get a nice variety of different expressions across the faces and all of that kind of stuff. Now, aside from Rembrandt, one of our other more prominent, artists from the Dutch Netherlands is Johannes Vermeer. And here we can see what's thought to be the only self-portrait of Johannes Vermeer. But he's an interesting figure. He only does about 30 paintings in his lifetime. He's also a kind of hotel manager, if you will. But he starts to do a lot of scenes that start to develop the idea of like landscape and genre painting especially. So here we can see this is the view of Delft. So this is Delft, Holland, where Vermeer was from and where he lived and worked and everything. But this is kind of in the realm of landscape painting, although it's more of a cityscape. But once again, he's looking at common everyday kinds of subject matter, stuff that was present to him. But these kinds of cityscapes become a major kind of subject within the art of Northern Baroque, kind of Europe, because once again, we're not focused on religious subjects. Instead, we're focused on common everyday kinds of events. But what's interesting about these, in my opinion, is it gives us a look or view of, what these places looked like in the past, as opposed to, say, what they look like now, where we get, like historical and contemporary buildings all kind of intermingled, and everything like that. So it gives us kind of an insight into the past, if you will. But Vermeer is also well known for doing portraiture, for doing genre paintings and whatnot. This is probably his most famous portrait. This is Girl with a Pearl Earring. And this is also meant to hearken to this idea of exoticism. The Dutch Netherlands are major merchants at this time. They're trading quite extensively throughout Europe and with the Americas, and, in India and other places like that. You might have heard of the Dutch East India Company and everything like that. So this is meant to hearken to this idea of exoticism, in that, the woman is not wearing a traditional kind of head garment that would be worn by European women at the time. Instead, it's more of a turban-like kind of feel. But we also have, this homage to, she's wearing this massive pearl earring and everything like that. But very soft, very kind of subdued feeling to it as well. This is oftentimes referred to as one of the greatest portraits ever made. In fact, there's a really interesting novel based on this portrait, and a movie that's adapted from that's pretty interesting. It shows kind of not only what life in this time period would have been like, but it also deals a lot with, Vermeer's actual technique. And, you can see in it a nice example of how paint would be made at that time, all kinds of things like this. But aside from works like this, Vermeer is probably most well known for his genre paintings. Most of his genre paintings look a lot like this. They're all kind of in the same location. This is actually the artist's studio, but he does a variety of these, and they all focus on a variety of different common people, servants and whatnot that he would have interacted with. So here we can see the milkmaid, and so we can see her pouring off the kind of cream off of the milk pitcher there. But once again, it's just highlighting everyday common people, and kind of uplifting them into this more prominent kind of role within the art world, but also within society, and all of these kinds of things. So it's important in that regard. Now, aside from all of that landscape, genre, portraiture, all of this kind of still stuff, we also see a proliferation of still life painting during this period, especially in the Dutch Netherlands as well. And so this still life refers to a painting which subjects are arranged from inanimate objects. So, we're going to have a variety of different objects all present. Here we can see a pretty typical one. So this is a banquet still life. So these are very typical. So you'll see like this kind of table with rich food and all of this kind of stuff, laid out. So it's meant to echo this kind of finery, or once again, the secular kind of dimensions of life. Many of these still lifes also take on a kind of moral message in them as well, what's known as a vanitas still life. We touched on that a little bit earlier on, but they'll have a kind of moral message that, enjoy all this nice finery, but, remember that you're going to have to atone, at some point when you die. So don't enjoy everything too much. Don't take it into the realm of sin and everything like that. But, it's kind of interesting aspect there as well. But we also begin to see landscape painting becoming much more prominent during this period, especially once again in the Dutch Netherlands as well. So here we can see an example. This is an Italian landscape, but it's by a Dutch artist named Jan Both. So many artists are still, they're traveling around, they're going to Italy to learn from the Renaissance masters, all of this kind of stuff. But once again, we start to see, these landscape scenes, and we're not really meant to take a lot of, allegorical sense from them. They are just meant to be kind of pleasing images to look at and everything like that. Now, sometimes, in this sense, we have a very small human presence, but once again, owing to that, Peter Bruegel landscape that we saw with the flight into Egypt, some of them do have very subtle homages to, biblical narrative, or to say classical mythology, all different kinds of things like that. But usually the landscape is the main subject matter of them, and then the kind of human presence or allegorical presence within the landscape scene is much more minuscule, much more downplayed, everything like that. Now, That brings us to the Rococo period, and this is a period between roughly 1720 and the 1780s, and it was almost exclusively French in style. So this is really when France becomes a prominent artistic powerhouse within Europe. So France begins to kind of supplant Italy as the main kind of art center of Europe at this time. But it does last a little bit later, depending on where we're at. In Germany, southwestern Germany, especially in Bavaria, there's a kind of interesting holdover of Rococo a little bit later on as well. But once again, the majority of Rococo art is going to be French. And most of its subject matter is very decorative in nature. It's meant to kind of represent very pleasing subjects, but it's also kind of considered to be a light and playful version of Baroque artwork. So it does deal with mythical subjects quite a bit. It also deals with genre subjects quite a bit. But it also has this kind of sensuality within it. So it upplays this kind of sensual quality in a variety of ways. Not only mythical, kind of subjects, but also the kind of sensuality in genre or everyday kinds of subjects as well. But this kind of sensual and mythological aspect are kind of the main aspects in the forefront of Rococo art. So there is also an extremely exaggerated and kind of frivolous kind of outlook. So it's really focused on this kind of lifestyle of the French aristocracy at this time, which, if we are unfamiliar, they're living these really luxurious lifestyles. They're having, like big banquets and getting drunk and having orgies, and meanwhile the French public is starving to death because they're footing the bill for all of this kind of luxury lifestyle. So Rococo art tends to focus on these kinds of things. Once again, it's being made specifically for the French aristocracy and everything like that. But it also tends to have a very romantic and a very kind of free of hardships kind of appearance to it and everything like that. So we'll see some examples. I don't have many examples. Once again, Rococo is not a very prominent art form, but we do need to talk about it. So probably the most famous, the most well-known, the most, the most prominent of the Rococo artists is this individual, Francois Boucher. Sorry, hiccups. But so we've seen some of Boucher's work before, if we remember back to that discussion of beauty and everything within art. So very, very prominent. He was also one of the major court painters of King Louis XIV, as well as King Louis XV and everything like this. So very, very prominent artist of his day. But he's really well known for doing all of these very kind of sensual, almost sexual kinds of paintings. Here we can see a subject that he does quite a few times. This is portrait of Marie Louise Murphy, and this is actually the mistress of King Louis XIV. So once again, it embraces this kind of sexual quality a little bit more. It's definitely much more frivolous, very controversial, comparatively speaking. But once again, this is an aspect of French aristocratic lifestyle in which, we're engaged in like arranged marriages, but then we're cheating on our wives with our lovers and, all of this kind of idea. But he's probably more well known for his mythical works, aside from his kind of genre works, which we saw a minute ago. But here we can see just another one of his mythical works. So here we can see Venus at the Forge of Vulcan, and this is actually part one of 6 paintings in a series. That painting that we saw earlier in the semester, Apollo confiding the infant Baucis to the nymphs of Nysa. That's also from the same series of mythical works. These are all taken from the Metamorphoses by Ovid, so they are all mythical subjects dealing with transformations and things like that. But once again, we usually see these kind of high points in the action of these stories. So we can see, Venus, the god of love and desire, descending from the heavens to, get these arms for her, her lover and whatnot from Vulcan's forge and whatnot. So once again, it has this, very kind of, sensual quality. We see everyone's kind of nude and, everything like that. But we have a lot of this kind of swirling clouds and soft pastel colors, which are meant to echo this idea of harmony within the scene and, this kind of pleasing, sensual nature. But we also see that echoed in the form of the composition as well, in that we have these nice subtle kind of curves versus, say, the kind of overt action in, Baroque art and everything like that. So once again, it becomes more sensual in general. Now, aside from Boucher, we also have some prominent female artists becoming, kind of in the forefront. So here we can see this is a portrait of Marie Antoinette, but it's by a very prominent French female artist of this time, and this is Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And so she is actually the exclusive portraitist of Marie Antoinette. So almost every portrait you've ever seen of Marie Antoinette was painted by Vigée-Lebrun, but she also, kind of echoes this idea of, the kind of extreme fashion of that time. Marie Antoinette herself was kind of a fashionista, if you will. She started a lot of these major trends of like these really large, elaborate, kind of gowns and dresses and these really massive like wig hairstyles and, all kinds of crazy stuff. But once again, Marie Antoinette, because of her kind of luxury lifestyle and her kind of view of derision towards the common people, or at least her perceived derision to the common people, makes her kind of a hated figure in France. She's actually Austrian by birth and everything like that. So she's kind of considered to be an outsider and everything like this. But once again, we start to see these really nice kind of portraits coming out of this time period as well, hearkening to many of these same kind of ideas. But aside from Vigée-Lebrun, we also have another prominent Rococo artist named Jean-Henri Fragonard. And so here we can see his most well-known painting, and this is The Swing. But this echoes this whole idea of the French aristocratic lifestyle and this kind of sensual, frivolous kind of nature. So we can see a scene that's meant to hearken this idea of flirtation, but it's also meant to hearken to this idea of like sexuality and everything like that. So we can see, this kind of noble woman who's being, she's swinging on the swing. We have her attendant in the background, kind of helping her, and then we have this, kind of peeping Tom like, guy who's her lover, if you will, but he's kind of effectively looking up her skirt, if you will. So once again, it plays up this kind of frivolous nature. It plays up this whole, kind of sensual sexuality and everything like that. This would have also been a controversial painting for its day, in that, to show your ankles and your feet like this would have been considered very taboo, which is kind of interesting in my opinion, considering many of these dresses are also, really, really well known for, showing massive amounts of cleavage and all that kind of stuff. But once again, this would have been considered a kind of, frivolous painting for its day. And once again, playing up this idea of flirtation, of sexuality, and all of this kind of stuff. Now, one last one to end us off with. Here we can see the other most prominent Rococo artist, Jean-Antoine Watteau. But this is the Embarcation to Cythera. And this is an interesting painting, in my opinion, because it embraces not only this whole idea of the kind of frivolity and kind of extremity of the French aristocratic lifestyle, but it also blends into classical mythology as well. So Cythera in classical mythology referred to this kind of island of earthly paradise, if you will. And so it's a place where the deities would go and they would covert, and like the Cupid angels would kind of flirt with nymphs and all this kind of fun stuff. But in this sense too, the French aristocracy would actually travel to this small island on the Seine River and they, you know, outside of Paris, and they referred to it as Cythera, but they would go to this island and they would have like picnics and like these large scale wild parties with orgies and, you know, all kinds of stuff like that. So this painting is meant to echo that idea. So we see these, you know, French nobles coming to this, you know, kind of mythical place. We see those, you know, kind of putti or cherub angels, hearkening to that idea of, you know, Venus, the goddess of love and desire, and everything like that. But everyone's kind of cavorting and having a good time. We can see, you know, the couple over here, this, you know, kind of guys trying to flirt up this woman over here, and, you know, all of these kinds of things. But once again, a lot of Rococo, fairly basic. It really plays up this kind of sensual, sexual, frivolous kind of lifestyle of the French nobility at that time, and everything like that. But it's a fairly short-lived style. Obviously, once the French Revolution comes about, this style basically abruptly ends overnight, and everything like that. And we'll get more into that a little later on as well. But that ends us off today with the Baroque Rococo and everything. So the next time we're going to start looking, we're going to shift away from Europe for a little bit, and we're going to look at some non-Western or non-European traditions. So specifically, we'll get into Asia, and then we'll look at the artwork of Islam, Africa, Oceania, and the pre-Columbian Americas. So be looking for that. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you again next time.